So I'm happy here to announce our next speaker. That's Stephen Hill. He's a senior e-commerce strategist at Vimo, and he's going to be speaking on evolution of commerce. Please welcome him.
Thank you. Thanks very much for the introduction. Yeah, I've got a lot of slides to get through, so I'm going to go really quickly, and I hope we can have some questions at the end. So I'm going to talk about the evolution of commerce, and then I'm going to talk about what transcends it and what's still relevant today as was in the past. A little bit about me. I'm from London, if you didn't guess, and yeah, I have an interest in psychology and classics, but I've been working in e-commerce for 12 years, 8 of which have been specifically in Magento. My kind of history has been conversion rate optimization, so what makes a good website and what makes a bad website, and looking at customer experience as a whole. And in the UK, I lead a strategy and consulting team to help clients grow. And you've probably, I understand Vimo is quite a big deal here in Kiev, but we're much smaller in the UK, but we're one of the sponsors here today, and if you get an opportunity to speak to any Vimo employees, please do, because there's a lot of them here today. I'm very, very lucky to get to work with some real household names and some amazing brands. So I have a lot of experience over the last kind of 12 years. I'm going to go through quite quickly here and talk about the principles of persuasion. When I first started speaking about 5 years ago, I used to talk about conversion rate optimization and tactics of what you can do to improve a website. The more I learned about that, the more I realized a lot of it was behavioral psychology. And so I got kind of deeper into that as well. I'm going to start off by framing this talk by talking about a company called Qubit. Some of you might have heard of them. They're enterprise-level personalization software. It's a spin-off from some Google employees. They're based out of London. A couple of years ago, they released a white paper, which you can still download today, and if you're interested, I recommend you do it. What is unusual about it is it's not accessible at all. It's an academic white paper with lots of standard deviation, lots of graphs, lots of bell curves, lots of correlations. But what's good for people like me is that they're able to summarize it at the start. And here, basically what it was an analysis of 6,500 A/B tests and multivariant tests to show what works in e-commerce and what doesn't work in e-commerce. And similarly, with all academic white papers, there's always an abstract, and they have a conclusion in this very start. So here they say that they found that cosmetic changes have a far smaller impact on revenue than treatments grounded in behavioral psychology. So what is an example of that? An example of a cosmetic change would be something like this: changing the color of an add to cart button from blue to green. That's an example of a cosmetic change. And if you're spending your time doing cosmetic changes, you are wasting your time doing this. One of the other things which kind of crystallized this talk was the reading of this book by Cialdini, who's a psychologist, in the 1980s. And if you're a marketer, you probably would have read this, but for Magento developers, probably not. But it's really interesting, the psychology of persuasion. So I'm going to look at evolution from the ancient past to today. And in 2019, everyone's glued to their phones, and I'm always interested in that and why that is. And so much has changed so quickly that it's important to look at the past and see where we've come from. So what do all these companies have in common? I can tell you one thing, that 15 years ago, none of them existed. And that highlights the fact of how quickly things are changing in this industry. So I wanted to look at what anchors us, what's unavoidable, what grounds us, and what's effective in the past is still effective today. So I'm going to go through time, and I'm going to start 10,000 years ago. Here is an example of some Magento developers 10,000 years ago doing a code review or something. It's very difficult to get photos from 10,000 years ago, but this is the best I got. What's interesting about this is physiologically and behaviorally, 10,000 years ago, we're identical to how we are today. There's been no changes in our bodies or our brains. And this is obviously before we had commerce, before we had money, before we had anything like that. This stage is called the self-sufficiency stage. And those of you that are familiar with Maslow's hierarchy of needs, when we're at this stage, we're very much looking at the bottom two rungs of the ladder here. So the physiological needs, food, water, warmth and rest, and safety needs, safety and security. We're not thinking about anything else. We're just thinking about survival and maybe procreation. In terms of tools, you might have had something like this. You wouldn't have traded it, you would have kept it within your family or within your tribe. You might have had something like this, some pelts, it might have been passed on to generations, but no real commerce to speak of at this point. So I'm going to fast forward through time. That animation represents time travel, by the way, to 3,500 years ago. And this, we're progressing here. And here there is an example of a trade of some sort, a bartering. As the wants of people increase with the development of society, there's an advancement of civilization. So this is called the barter system. And if you've been to, now as I'm British, I'm not very good at bartering, but if you go to North Africa, that's all they do. For every kind of transaction, there will always be bartering involved. Also, a development that happened about 3,500 years ago was a very basic, rudimental form of money. These are cowrie shells. Some of you might have seen them before. They look a bit like pasta, but evolutionary anthropologists argue whether this was actually body ornamentation, like jewelry or something like that. But it's something small, something precious, something distinctive, which could represent value between people. It didn't work super well because in some areas they were plentiful and some areas they were scarce. So it's very difficult to use it as a rudimentary money system. However, this was quickly replaced with the gold standard of gold. And this has stuck around. And what was good about gold was that it's equally scarce across the globe. So a small amount of gold holds the same value wherever you are in the globe. And if we jump back to Maslow's hierarchy of needs, now we're getting on to the psychological needs, the self-esteem needs, prestige, accomplishment, accumulating wealth, friendships and things like that. So it's getting much more interesting. I'll fast forward again, 2,500 years ago. This is where we get the first example of money. And something incredibly we still have today. And if I'm ever lucky enough to become a grandparent, I'm sure I'll be asked, did you actually carry around bits of metal in your pocket and bits of paper in your pocket to exchange with people, and did people trust that and use that? And I'll be able to say, yes, we did. What's good about money, above and beyond the bartering system, is that if you wanted to defer a payment or have a divisible payment, or the place of payment was difficult, money could do that. If you wanted to split a cow in half, it's very difficult to do that, but with money, it's much easier to do that divisibility. And as a result of money coming in, you get things, credit systems and all kinds of wealth accumulation going on. So origin of money is the third important one. And you get things like this. You get marketplaces, and you get kind of democracy evolving as we go forward with money. Fast forward again, 1,500 years ago. This is where we get to a point where the buying and selling of goods are done within a country, and you might trade with your neighbor's village, and your neighbor might be good at creating something, and you might be good at creating something else, and you end up with these beautiful kind of trade routes which evolve over time. And here you can trace something. If something was manufactured in China and ended up in Portugal, how did it get there? And you could plot along this route. It would have been traded by neighbors ongoing. A lovely kind of example there. And this brings us to a national economy. So the buying and selling of goods is all done within the country. I'll fast forward again. We're going very quickly through time to 100 years ago. This is still part of the national economy, but at first what we had was small businesses. Everywhere was a small business. So you'd have a local shop, which you would go to, selling products sourced locally to local residents and local businesses. And this went on for about 100 years. And there's a certain romance attached to something like this, where the owner of the shop would know you by name. He would know what you bought in the past. He would know if you would potentially be interested in something coming in. Kind of like a personalized service. And you could maybe draw parallels to what's happening today in e-commerce with a personalization, so that when you visit a website, for example, Amazon, it's very much a personalized, tailored experience, and your Amazon homepage will be very different to your neighbor's Amazon homepage. Fast forward again to 40 years ago, getting into living memory now. And this was the rise of the corporations. So this was the kind of the antithesis, the opposite of the local village store. So this was the establishment of chain stores and department stores and based out of town. And this really was the death knell sound for the small local shop, which couldn't compete in terms of economies of scale and prices. And so small retailers came to an end. And certainly in the UK, there's kind of a balance going on that some people still like to go to the small kind of local independent ones. I'll fast forward again, 25 years ago, so it's going to start getting interesting now. Here, and you could argue that this was, I'm sure some of you as old as me will remember installing this for the first time. You could say this was where a pendulum swung back the other way. In terms of small retailers, again, big people like Walmart, for example, were very slow to embrace technology and e-commerce, and it was the small, nimble movers who were very quick to get on board with this. I got a couple of examples here. If you remember a bookshop from the 1980s, this was a kind of, I can't speak for Kiev, obviously, but an otherworldly experience in that you never really knew how did they sort it. Did they sort it by category? Did they sort it by author? And then there was something like an ISBN number, which you had to understand. And it could be in multiple places. You didn't know what you're looking for. And often people in there were quite learned. It was a bit of an intimidating experience. Some might argue a more romantic period of discovery in trying to find a book in here. But in 1994, this was replaced by this. And what was good about this is you could then search by author, you could search by title, you could search by keyword, you could search by ISBN number. And also the birth of kind of product search as well. And very quickly afterwards, the birth of recommendations. I'm sure you're all familiar with Amazon's algorithm and how it works, and also reviews as well. Again, I apologize, I don't know how popular or present Amazon is here, but in the US certainly, and in the UK, it's the de facto thing for recommendations and reviews. Similarly, if you were trying to sell something yourself, a personal item, you didn't have too many options. You maybe put a little note up somewhere in a shop, or in a post office, or in a local paper, or you told your friends, or you told your families, hey, I'm trying to sell something, I'm trying to get rid of something. But again, and this was a fundamental change for me personally growing up, the beginnings of eBay, it felt like a beautifully kind of universal democratic system where anyone could sell anything to anyone. And a wonderful example built on the power of the internet. So probably something which inspired me to get into e-commerce, and you were able to find things on eBay that you would have had no chance of getting in your local shop. So very, very exciting. A slightly more boring example of something that happened in 1995 is Netscape developed encryption and secure socket layer, and something which we wouldn't be able to do what we're doing without. A bit of a game changer there. And then I'll talk about this. So 20 years ago, some of you might remember this. I was at university when this happened, and this was the dot-com crash. We survived the millennium bug, and then we had the dot-com crash, and this was basically a representation of people's understanding of what the internet and the World Wide Web potential was. Whatever industry you worked in, whether you were a teacher or a nurse or a builder, your job was going to change because of the internet. And this was this spike of understanding of everyone saying, we're going online, we're going to do it on the web. And that enthusiasm, whilst it all came too quickly and spiked too soon, was correct. Everyone's job, everyone's industry was going to change as a result of this. And if you look at the next 20 years, you can see, this is the NASDAQ, for example, what did happen. And the investment in technology and the internet was well-founded. And this is another talk I do, but if any of you are interested in the blockchain and Bitcoin, we saw a very similar spike when people's understanding of what the blockchain was going to do, and in the next 20 years, I'm sure we'll see a similar kind of graph with blockchain. Another 15 years ago, another very boring example is PCI. Again, This was the kind of turning point for e-commerce where the payment card industry was set up, and it was then you were reassured that this wasn't the Wild West, and you could buy things online, and you weren't going to get, it wasn't going to be fraudulent. And this is the point where not so much my generation, the early adopters, but my parents' generation were now, okay, it's okay to buy something online. So a big change. And then we get to 5 years ago, and you can probably guess what I'm going to mention here. The biggest change we had 5 years ago, and if you were at any conferences, this was the tipping point of people actually getting a smartphone, and everyone started doing things on their phone rather than their desktop. And well, at Vimo, we have some clients who are 95% based on mobile. And certainly in territories such as India or China, they have no experience of desktop. They don't own a desktop. They've never seen the internet on a desktop. So really important. And this is not going anywhere. Mobile is here to stay. So that is my very quick summary timeline. Yeah, and I'll just say this is where we are now. We're a global economy. We all use mobile devices. It's not possible for a single country to produce all the goods they need. We have to work together with the rest of the world. So what I went through was these 5 stages: self-sufficiency with the cavemen, bartering system, the origin of money, a national local economy, up to a global economy. So what I want to do now to pull this together with today's stuff is look at what would work for these guys on the left, if these are Gen Z or millennials, and what would work for the good guys on the right from 10,000 years ago. Is there anything which pulls us together? And if I had to market to both of these people, what would I do? What would I use? What techniques? So I've got 4, which I will go through very quickly. The first one, social proof. I'm sure you will have heard of this, collective opinion, sometimes it's called, herd mentality. This was effective 1,000 years ago, 2,000 years ago, 10,000 years ago. The Colosseum, for example. If you can show that something is popular, people are attracted to it. Doesn't matter what it is. As humans, we want to back winners, and we don't want to back losers. An example I use of the current day is the queue outside the nightclub. Why is there a queue outside the nightclub? It's not because the nightclub is busy. It's because the owners of the nightclub want you to think it's busy. So you have a very long, very thin queue to make it look like it's a very popular place to be. And similarly, maybe you see a classic example as 2 restaurants next door to each other. One is very busy, very lively, very loud. The other one is empty. No one's in there. Which one do you want to go to? You want to go to the busy one. You want to go to the one which is popular. So the idea here of collective opinion is to get people beyond reasonable doubt using social proof. If it's working for everyone else, it's probably a good bet that it's going to work for me. So this is a shortcut that our brains take in order to ensure our evolutionary survival. If we go with the herd, if we go with the masses, it's probably a safe bet. If they're drinking that water, it's probably safe to drink. Now, it might not be true, but that's what our brains are doing. So here's some examples of social proof. This is what social proof looks like today. How many retweets, how many likes, how many favorites, how many shares. I don't know who this person on the right is, but I know it's an important picture because it's got 3.5 million likes. Similarly, in e-commerce in particular, we know that reviews, the more reviews you have, lead to more purchases. If you have no reviews on a product, you're far better off having 100 reviews on a product. They don't all have to be 5-star products. In fact, the data suggests you don't want 100% 5 stars, but also, and I'll use these guys as an example as well, because Amazon do reviews so well, probably the first to do it, and now it's got to the point where you get to review the review. So it's kind of like an inception where they then ask you, is this a good review or not? So it's a meta. And then in terms of what we're seeing with kind of Vimo clients today is social proof is now so closely related with user-generated content as well. So we have examples here where people will upload photos of themselves wearing the products, and there's no better kind of marketing that you can get than you get fans, loyal advocates, kind of selling your stuff for you. Really super, super strong stuff. So the conclusion there is social proof would have been effective 10,000 years ago, still effective today. Next one I'm going to talk about is scarcity. Scarcity from an evolutionary point of view, when a resource is scarce, whatever it is, it immediately becomes precious. So an example of scarcity here is an example. I hope you don't have this happen in Kiev on Black Friday, maybe you do, but this is where people get injured and there's a huge amount of enthusiasm and excitement to try and get a bargain because it's scarce. So here's an example. And I know from having worked in e-commerce and having spoken to retailers that things like Black Friday or Cyber Monday, it's not a real thing. That the manufacturers, for example, the clothes are made in different factories to different specifications, much lower quality, but they're brought in, they have to be sold for a few weeks at an overinflated high price, and then they can do the 60% off or whatever. Similarly with these LG TVs, I'm sure it's not a great deal. Another nice example, this was when you signed up for a mailbox account, immediately they'd tell you where you are in the queue. So they tell you 36,000 people are in front of you in the queue, which is initially quite demoralizing, but then they tell you there's 600,000 people behind you in the queue. So that flips it, and then you're thinking, actually, I've made a good decision here. This must be scarce resource. I'm in a good position. I'm going to stay with it. So the conclusion there is, if it's hard to get, then it must be worth something. And again, it's not true, but it's a shortcut that we take to make quicker decisions in our life. So, assume scarcity. This would work today, it would have worked in the past. Next one, urgency. So, in the past, in prehistoric times, if something was urgent, it was probably a life or death scenario. Very much on the bottom rung of Maslow's hierarchy there. But today, if something is urgent, here's an example. It feels bad to miss out on something. So here's an example of happy hour. It ends at 8 o'clock tonight. I need to get to the bar before 8 o'clock, otherwise the cocktails are going to be twice the price, and I'm going to pay double, and I don't like that, and we hate the feeling of that. This feels urgent immediately. So this ties into something called the appointment dynamic. Where do we see this in e-commerce? Very powerful. You see this all the time. So low stock. This is an example of urgency. Countdown timers, very effective as well. Things like this, in someone else's bag, check back in 16 minutes. Only 2 of these left. There's a great book called Nudge, about nudge marketing. And these little pop-ups, maybe you've seen them, this is saying someone else in your town bought this as a kind of reassuring social proof as well as urgency. If you've booked a hotel, they'll say things like this, I'm not sure if you can read it, but it says, prices for your dates have been going up over the last 10 days. Very annoying to read that. Similarly, this is one for Airbnb, which I booked, and it says, people are looking at this place, and 3 of them are looking at the exact dates that you are looking at. Similarly, you would have all seen this. 2 other people are looking at this hotel right now, and there's only 1 room left at this price. Bit of uncertainty there as well. And these guys, the airline industries, are probably the worst/best at this, where they'll say something like, 2 seats left at this price. What does that mean? They don't say if it's going to go up, might go down. You don't know. But either way, don't take the risk. Buy it now. And this is one from a few months ago on EasyJet, and they actually put hurry, exclamation mark. They're open about it, saying hurry, don't wait. There's only 2 seats left at this price. So the conclusion here is we hate to miss out on stuff, and fear is a really powerful motivator. Encourages us to act quickly. And again, it might not be true. It might not be true, but it's effective, and it's a shortcut we take. If something feels urgent, we want to do it and do it quickly. So I'll conclude that urgency works today as it would have worked 10,000 years ago as well. And the last one, I'm conscious of time, an engaging narrative. So this is the ancient human desire to enjoy a story. Thank you. If you're lucky enough to have children, you might find that you have to read them a story every night. This is an example of the famine stone in Egypt, and it's a very old story, basically, about a 7-year famine, and it's got characters, and it's got a beginning, a middle, and an end. And if you ever watch any kind of reality TV, again, I'm not familiar with what's popular in Kiev, but in the UK, you'll find this is a singing competition, talent competition, where people will sing, and they will probably sing for maybe 2 or 3 minutes. But what the production team will do is they will have 15 minutes of backstory about that contestant, where they grew up, their hardship, their drama, their adversity, their disability, whatever, why you should back this singer. Nothing to do with whether they're a good singer or not. But we overlook that. We want to buy into the story. And this is probably the best example. I'll try and talk about it very, very quickly. So I'm conscious of time. This was something about 10 years ago called the Significant Objects Project. And what they did was they went to garage car boot sales, like jumble sales, where you're buying secondhand stuff from people's garages. And they bought 100 objects for $1 each. And then they listed them all on eBay. So they had a photo of them. So it might be a shoe, it might be a plate, it might be a knife or a toy or something. But what they did was they got professional copywriters, professional storytellers to write a short story about 100 of these items, where the protagonist of the story was the item that was purchased. So it might have been this item was involved in a crime, or this item was involved in an historical event, or it might have magical powers, or it's a very lucky object, etc., etc. So when all these items were listed on eBay with their beautiful stories and beautiful pictures, it sold for $8,000, all these items. Amazing example. And even in the eBay description, they even said, this is a fictional story about this item. But people were so impressed and so engaged with the story that they wanted to purchase the item. So a good example of the power of storytelling. This is a client of Vimo's, and they came to us with the proposition of, we want to tell, not sell. Rather than being aggressive with selling, they wanted to tell a story. And if you've ever seen a Jack Daniel's advert, you might sometimes see it's just a wall of text. It's just a long story about Lynchburg and the distillery and all of that. The last one I'm going to mention is this brand here, which I hope some of you are familiar with. It's not a Vimo client, but I read an article with the founder, a really interesting guy, and about his life, about his principles, about the environment, and I immediately wanted to buy a jacket from them. Not because I wasn't too fussed about the color of it or the fit of it, but I wanted to be part of this story. So they've done a lot of interesting stuff. They took out a full-page advert in the New York Times saying, don't buy this jacket, which is a really interesting approach to take on Black Friday. And they wanted to focus on, can you reduce the amount of things that you purchase? If you buy anything from the Patagonia website, they will repair it free of charge. How nice is that? They want you to reuse it, recycle it, and reimagine it. And then they do things like this, like when it's an election day and there's polling, they will close their stores. And when Trump gave them their tax rebate, they donated it all to charity. So a really nice story that I wanted to be connected to and attached to and be involved with, not because they make beautiful products, but because I bought into the story. So this is what we're seeing. So brands which are really succeeding today differentiate themselves through storytelling. And again, it might not be true. It might not be a true story, like the significant objects. It might be a lie, but it will always be effective. If someone's able to tell you a good story, you will buy into it. So I'll just wrap up now and return to this academic white paper about what works in e-commerce and what doesn't. And what they have, fortunately, is they have a key findings section at the end, where they conclude, after looking at 6,500 experiments, which experiments are effective and which are not. And they say the three which are the most effective are scarcity, urgency, and social proof. And the ones which are not effective, you can see, for example, there, changing the color of a button. After looking at 6,500 experiments, there was 0.0% uplift. And similarly, call to actions, changing something to buy now or add to basket, whatever, don't bother. So those are the ones I've spoken about. If you get to see me speak at a longer e-commerce psychology one, I talk about a lot of other ones, which are behavioral psychology principles. But I will wrap it up there, and we can do some questions, if anyone's got any questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Stephen. That was really informative. So, any questions?
If you don't have any questions, I'm very happy to tell you what some of the popular questions I get asked are.
Yes, I may ask you one,
Yeah, go
if
ahead.
you don't mind. You were telling about the evolution, so what do you think, like, what's you going to predict going to happen in the next, let's say, 5 years? I believe it's going to be in like 5, 10 years.
Very difficult for me to say what's going to happen in the next 5 years. I can tell you what's not going away, and that's mobile phones. Everyone has got a smartphone. It's going to be in your pocket. You're going to be connected at all times. So I think forget about desktop. I wrote an article last month about saying desktop is dead, and I think I would stand by that. About conversational commerce, yes, I think there's a place for it. Having someone smarter than me said, brands actually want to be people. That's what they want, and people want to be brands. And I think that idea, so for example, Patagonia, you might follow them on Facebook, but actually the next stage is having them in your contacts, like in your WhatsApp conversations, and they can sell to you through WhatsApp and whatever. I think also voice, I'm not sure about voice, to be honest, and then VR and AR, again, I'm not sure, but I think mobile's going to be here for the next 5 years for sure. Happy to take any other questions, otherwise I can go through what I sometimes get asked. One is about ethics. So when I go through, there's kind of 10 or 12 different psychological principles that I sometimes talk about. Is it morally right to do these? Are these manipulative things to do to people? And yeah, I think it's a bit of a grey area. I'd say the difference between the kind of coercion and it's the intent behind it. If you're selling good products at a good price, I think it's fine to take advantage of these behavioral psychology techniques. If your products are crappy and they're overpriced and they're not good quality and you're trying to sell them quickly, then I would have a problem with it, I think. Yeah. So sometimes it can be manipulative. Other questions? So, for example, the scarcity and urgency thing, which is very, very effective and popular. Some brands that won't fit with. If you're working with a very high-end luxury brand like a Gucci or a Burberry, they would never do something like that. It would harm their brand. But if we're talking about conversion rate and what's effective in e-commerce, then these are the techniques which work. Burberry, we're in the press. Yeah, sure.
Yeah, wanted to ask if you could suggest something to read or some, I don't know, articles, books, or just any kind of resource where we can find some interesting ideas.
Yeah, so there's a guy called Richard Shotton, and he wrote a book last year called The Choice Factory, and a lot of it focuses on psychology and interesting examples in the real world. There was one told to me a couple of days ago, an example in the wine section in the supermarket. They started playing French music in the wine section of the supermarket, and immediately the sale of French wines went up double. And then the next day they'd play German music, and the German wines started selling better as well. So there's lots of interesting examples in the book like that, which I'd recommend. That's a question at the back. I'm sorry if we're running out of time.
Yeah, we're actually a little bit pressed with time, but I believe for all of those of you who still have questions left, you can find Steven here around, right? We're going to have a coffee break shortly.
Yeah,
so.
This is my Twitter if you want to get me on Twitter. And yeah, I'll be on the Vimo stand for a little bit.
Yep, definitely. Thank you then, and thank you for a great speech once more.
No problem.